right, let's go ahead and get started so we can make the most use out of our time. Welcome, everyone. I'm so delighted to welcome you all to our webinar today. My name is Marissa Hall, and I'm on faculty at the University of North Carolina. And first, I'd like to thank everyone who helped make this webinar possible, including healthy eating research, as well as our three amazing panelists, my co-moderator, Christina Roberto, and our graduate student coordinator, Anna Paula Richter. We will be recording this session and we'll make it available publicly on the Healthy Eating Research website after the webinar. So as you all know, today we are here to talk about front of package labeling on food products, which we believe is a very promising solution for informing consumers as well as promoting healthier dietary patterns. There's been recent momentum in the US toward front of package food labeling. And so in August of 2022, this year, 3 organizations submitted a citizens petition asking FDA to implement a mandatory interpretive front of package nutrition labeling system for packaged foods in the US. Additionally, the White House National Nutrition Strategy includes plans to develop a front of packaged food labeling system to quickly and easily communicate nutrition information. And finally, FDA is working on developing a new healthy symbol for the front of packaged foods. So given the interest in national food labeling in the US, the goal of this webinar today is to talk about what a national food labeling system should look like. We'll have 3 panelists to comment on the policy landscape, research findings, as well as experiences from labeling implementation in the US and international contexts. I wanted to go over a few quick housekeeping items before we start. In terms of the structure for today's webinar, each of the 3 panelists will give about 5 minutes of comments verbally, and then we'll have about 20 minutes of a moderated conversation with the speakers, followed then by open questions from the audience. And so audience members, this is a webinar, so you will not have audio or video permissions, but please do type in your questions using the Q&A box. And I will then, at the end of the moderated discussion, I will read selected questions to the panelists after the pre-planned sessions are complete. The chat feature will be disabled for the audience. And next, I'll go ahead and introduce all 3 of our panelists before I turn things over to Christina. So first, we'll hear from Sarah Sorscher, JD, from the Center for Science in the Public Interest, or CSPI. Sarah is an experienced advocate with a passion for public health who fights for a safer, healthier, more transparent food system by promoting consumer safeguards in Congress, federal agencies, and state and local governments. As Deputy Director of Regulatory Affairs, she manages CSPI's policy work related to food safety and labeling, allergens, food additives, dietary supplements, and other consumer products. Her work includes serving on federal advisory committees, testifying before Congress and federal agencies, offering technical advice to policymakers, and providing commentary to the media on consumer and food safety issues. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Anna H. Grumman, a behavioral scientist studying food policy at Stanford School of Medicine. Her research seeks to promote the thoughtful design and implementation of policies that improve diet, promote environmental sustainability, and advance health equity. In her work, Dr. Grumman uses randomized trials, natural experiments, and simulation modeling to examine how food policies like warning labels, beverage taxes, and food assistance programs affect what we eat and how healthy we are. Dr. Grumman holds a PhD and MSPH from health behavior from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a BA in human biology from Stanford, and she completed her postdoctoral training at Harvard. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Gabriela Freites, who's an Associate Research Fellow in the Poverty, Health, and Nutrition Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute, or IFPRI. And her research interests are at the intersection of child obesity prevention, food policy, and consumer behavior, and her doctoral thesis involved evaluation of a national food labeling and advertising policy designed to improve the healthfulness of the food environment in Chile. Dr. Freites received her PhD in food and nutrition policies and programs from the Friedman School of Nutrition, Science, and Policy at Tufts University. So we wanted to go ahead and introduce our 3 speakers to be able to then kind of keep things moving. And so next, I'll hand things over to Dr. Christina Roberto, who is the Mitchell J. Blutt and Margot Crody Blutt Presidential Associate Professor of Health Policy at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Marissa. And I just want to quickly extend my thanks to all the panelists and Healthy Eating Research for sponsoring this. So we're going to have a very kind of conversational experience here, but we are going to hear just brief comments from each of the speakers. So Sarah, can you kick us off with kind of an overview of the advocacy landscape and the citizens petition?
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to start off by briefly introducing CSPI because we're sort of a unusual creature. We're a consumer advocacy organization. We're your food and health watchdog, and we're a nonprofit with an office in Washington, D.C., but with staff spread out across the country. And since 1971, we've been a leading voice for consumers in the food system. And our advocacy has been behind many of the rules that create basic transparency for consumers. So we pushed for the law the Nutrition Labeling Education Act, which I'll likely touch on a couple points during this presentation or this panel today, which authorizes the nutrition facts panel on packaged foods and requires ingredients disclosures and has rules around what kind of nutrient content claims you can put on packages. And we also fought for laws that require calorie disclosures on chain restaurant menus that have disclosures for allergens. And also some state and local policies. So the New York City and Philadelphia sodium warnings on menus. And we've recognized, we've long recognized really that the food label and the transparencies and protections that we have on the food label as currently designed are failing. They're failing to send the right message to consumers. And we live in environments that are increasingly dominated by ultra-processed foods, and we're presented with food packaging that makes the case for why these foods are appealing. It conveys the impression that they're healthful and nutritious, and meanwhile, the really critical, the important information is relegated to the back of the package, and it's very detailed. It uses math concepts like percent daily value based on a 2,000 calorie diet. And it doesn't offer a lot of interpretive information for consumers. And so in order to use it, consumers really have to bring their own knowledge base to bear. And this access to that type of knowledge is not universal. And if we look at who uses the NFP, it's really not surprising to see that people who have lower education levels, who have below high school level education, use it dramatically less than people with college above, graduate level and above. And that people who are dominant in English are able to use it more than people who are dominant in other languages. And so, there is a solution to this problem that we're talking about today, which is to move the key nutrition information to the front of the package and make it easier to understand. And CSPI actually first petitioned the FDA for such a front of package labeling system in 2006. And, FDA held a public meeting. There were 2 Institute of Medicine reports that came out in 2010, 2012, reviewing the research. And we saw the food industry quickly respond to this activity by developing an alternative system for front of package labeling known as facts up front, which is, as the name suggests, simply moving the facts from nutrition facts from the back of the package to the front. This system is inadequate, of course, because it doesn't really fill that nutrition literacy gap, right? It doesn't provide that interpretive information. So you can't tell, what is a high amount of sodium, that sodium is a nutrient to avoid, for example. And it's also voluntary, so it appears sporadically, and companies often place it, bottom right in low contrast so that it's hard to recognize. So people don't really know to look for it or notice it when it does appear. And at the same time, FDA under the Trump administration has proposed adopting an icon for foods that meet the government definition for the term healthy. And that term has been defined for many years, so it can only be used on products that meet a certain standard. But FDA is now working to update that definition. And it is plans to come out with a sort of icon or logo that would be a government endorsement, essentially an endorsement logo, and it would also be voluntary, and it would only highlight the positive attributes of a food. So we have sort of a current system that has a mandatory requirement for nutrition facts that is universal, but it's not very accessible or interpretive. We have facts up front, which is a voluntary system that is more accessible, but not interpretive and not universal. And then we have this proposal for a healthy logo, which would be interpretive only with respect to positive attributes and not universal. And so CSPI, am I running over time? I'm sorry, just flag me if I need to drop off.
Go ahead. Yeah, take one more minute.
Yeah, so I'm almost done. Okay, so this led us to decide, we had this older petition that it wasn't really clear, we said front of package labeling system, but we didn't say with specificity what that needed to look like. And so that led us to update our petition in August of this year of 2022. And we asked specifically, we said we need a front of package system that's mandatory, required on all packages, that is focused on nutrients, for reasons I'll get into a bit later, the legal reasons, and then that it's interpretive with respect to the levels of those nutrients. So added sugars, sodium, and saturated fat in particular need to be highlighted if they're high in those nutrients. And we also said that it should include a disclosure for calories. We're very heartened to see the White House recently put out a report on hunger, nutrition, and health, and it included a commitment by FDA to proposing a standardized front of package labeling system. It remains to be seen exactly what that will look like, and that's why it's really exciting to be here today with the research community talking about the evidence base and what we all can do to support that work.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was really great. You crammed in a lot of great information. So now we have a good understanding of the landscape and the advocacy and policy landscape. So let's turn it over to Anna for a brief overview on the state of research on front of package labeling.
Thanks, Christina, and thank you all for joining today. As Christina mentioned, I'll be providing a rapid overview of the state of the science of front of pack labels. And I want to reiterate what Sarah started with, which is why we're talking about new front of pack labels. And just to really zoom out, Marissa mentioned, continued high rates of diet-related disease in the US. And the reason that we think that food labels could be part of a suite of strategies we use to address that problem is because these labels provide us with information at the point of purchase, the exact moment when we really need that information to decide what to buy or what to eat. So it's a very well-timed intervention. And Sarah already highlighted why we think we need new food labels in addition to the nutrition facts label that we're all familiar with. And again, to reiterate, the short answer to that question is that the current food labels are underused. We often do not use them when we're deciding what to buy. And even when we do, we have considerable difficulty understanding that information. So they're underused and hard to understand. So in contrast, the type of labels I'm going to talk about in this short overview would be on the front of product packaging as opposed to the back, as Sarah mentioned, and would be interpretive. They would provide an evaluation of product healthfulness rather than only giving us numeric information without interpreting or providing some context for us. So I just want to talk about the type of labels that I'll be reviewing the evidence about. So what do we know about how these labels affect consumers? We have now a pretty good literature examining this question. And what that body of evidence finds is that well-designed interpretive front of pack labels can change what consumers buy in a way that's likely to be positive for public health. For example, there's now a large number of experimental studies that have used randomized designs to examine consumers' short-term or immediate responses to these interpretive labels. And those studies find that front of pack labels reduce purchases of unhealthy products like sugary drinks and ultra-processed snack foods. For example, one meta-analysis of experimental studies of front of package warning labels for sugary drinks found that on average, those warnings reduce purchases of sugary drinks by about 26%. So meaningful effect sizes. And those experimental studies provide strong causal evidence about these short-term responses to labels. In addition to that experimental literature, we also have a smaller but growing number of real-world studies that use quasi-experimental designs. And those studies also show that labels, when they're designed well, can change consumer behavior. For example, one quasi-experiment conducted in a hospital cafeteria in Boston found that sugary drink warnings with graphic images reduced purchases of sugary drinks by about 14.5%. And another similar quasi-experiment conducted in university cafeterias showed a 14% reduction in consumption of sugary drinks after implementing these warnings. We also have a number of studies coming out from Chile, which I think you'll hear about a little bit more later. Chile implemented nutrient warnings in 2016. These are labels that signal when products are high in nutrients of concern like sugar, saturated fat, calories, and sodium. And researchers have found that implementation of this policy was associated with 23 to 37% reductions in purchases of these nutrients of concern. So across the body of evidence, we're seeing that these warnings and these front of pack labels can change consumer behavior. A second question you might have is, how do front of pack labels affect the food supply, or the supply side of the supply demand equation? The evidence here is still emerging, so we have fewer studies addressing this question. But what we see so far is that front of pack labels can spur changes to the food supply. And the studies we have to date have focused mostly on Chile, which again implemented nutrient warnings in 2016. So for example, one study from Chile found that manufacturers reduced the sugar content of their breakfast cereals by about 11% after this warning label system was implemented. And researchers found that products were often reformulated so that their sugar content was just below the threshold that would trigger the mandatory warning, which suggests that these changes to the food supply were a direct response to the labeling laws, as opposed to reformulation that might have happened otherwise. Another study from Chile had similar findings. That work documented a 7 percentage point reduction in the prevalence of products that were high in calories, sodium, saturated fat, or sugar after warnings were implemented. So again, we're seeing across the studies that have been done so far that these systems can change the types of foods that companies are selling. So to summarize, front of pack labels are providing information at the point of purchase, which is a time when we really need that information. And when they're designed well, these interpretive front of pack labels have been shown to both encourage consumers to buy healthier foods and beverages, and potentially to spur manufacturers to remove some unhealthy nutrients from the food supply.
That's great, Anna. Thank you for that overview. In a couple of minutes, we'll come back because we're going to ask some questions about how to design these, and there's a nice question in the Q&A about that. So stay tuned. Before we do that, though, we have the pleasure of hearing from Gabby, who's going to talk about the international experience and perspective. There's a lot of great data from Chile, so we're going to turn it over to you to learn more about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina, and thank you for inviting me to join this amazing panel today. So I would like to specifically talk about the experience of the Latin America and the Caribbean region, and how the region became an actual leader in setting the agenda and implementing front of pack labeling policies to inform consumers and promote healthier diets. So there's a lot we can learn from the experience of several countries in the region. So the region has been leading the implementation of laws and regulations to modify the food environment countrywide as a response to the obesity and non-communicable diseases epidemic, which we all know that is an issue not only in the region, but worldwide. So some of the regulatory policies that were have been put in place in the region to address these issues include mandatory front of pack warning labels in most countries, taxation, school regulations, among other strategies. But I would like to briefly talk in the next few minutes about what were some of the factors that led to the successful implementation of front of pack labeling policies in the region. So first, I want to briefly mention that it was very important how the evidence was presented to policymakers to set the agenda for front of pack labeling policies. So it's important to note here that the evidence that was presented included both what were the health consequences of the lack of an appropriate front of pack labeling, and as well as the efficacy of the front of pack labeling in improving consumers' ability to make healthier choices. On another note, it's important also to mention that front of pack labeling was always framed as an instrument to accomplish populations' right to information, right to health, as well as children's right to be protected from harmful products. So the rights-based approach was also key to set the agenda for these policies. Second, I would like to mention also the openness to policy innovations and sharing of lessons learned between countries that happened after Chile started implementing the regulation back in 2016. So Chile was the first country in the region and in the world that introduced front of pack mandatory warning labels to identify products that were high in sugar, saturated fat, sodium, and calories, as Anna already mentioned, using the best evidence available at that time. But Chile clearly built some momentum for these policies that other governments in the region took advantage of and followed Chile's action. So for example, other countries such as Mexico, Argentina, Uruguay, Peru followed with similar regulations after a few years. And what's interesting about these countries' policy design and implementation is that as evidence and experience evolved over time, improvements to the front of pack labeling system continued. So for example, some countries implemented larger sizes for the labels. Other countries added some restrictions for health or nutrition claims. Other countries used a different nutrient profiling model that was already available for the region after 2016, that Chile could not use. So it was a the system continued to evolve over time. And third, I would like to also mention that it was key to have an objective definition of the foods that were going to be regulated. This was more difficult for Chile because at the time there was no regional nutrient profiling model that could be followed. So Chile had to work from scratch to determine which foods were going to be regulated. But this was not the case after 2016, when the region already had a regional nutrient profiling system proposed by the Pan American Health Organization. So for Mexico, Argentina, and other countries, it took much less time to decide on the products that should be regulated. So this is something that is key to consider when we are in the design stage of the regulation. And lastly, I would like to mention that another key factor that we need to consider is that the front of pack labeling policies were always framed as part of a package of regulations. So it's not, it was never framed as a standalone policy that will solve all the problems with population diets, but always as part of a package of regulations. In the case of Chile, for example, the regulation also included child-directed marketing restrictions, as well as school food environment modifications, where basically foods that had at least one front of pack warning label could not be sold, promoted, or marketed inside school. So these front of pack labeling policies also serve as a guideline for other regulations, such as marketing regulations and school regulations. We can discuss more of this later. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you, Gabby. Okay, so let me invite Sarah, Anna, and Gabby, please, the three of you, if you turn on your cameras, we'll start this conversation. So I want to start with a question. Anna, you gave a nice overview about the, effect sizes of these labels, which are actually, I think, bigger than a lot of us who work in this space would have predicted, and exciting. But it strikes me that it really matters how these are designed. And let me combine this with the audience question from Jim, which is, there are different approaches to design these, right? You can have ones that focus on the high-end sugar, salt, fat. You could have Nutri-Score that tries to be intuitive with letters. And so I'm curious about your research-informed opinion and a little bit about what do we know about the ingredients to design these well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say there's a few key design elements we know are important to include. One is that it's very helpful if the warning or the label can include an icon or an image or some sort of symbol that helps communicate the message. So that is one piece when it's possible. So for example, the warnings in Latin America are often the shape of a stop sign, which sort of helps communicate the message. We know that adding icons to labels can boost their efficacy. So that's one thing. Second is for them to be interpretive, as we've discussed. So not just numbers, but providing some evaluation to consumers. Third is to use simple language that's easier to access. And then in terms of whether it should focus on nutrients or be more of a summary score, we actually have not a lot of evidence pitting those systems against each other sort of head to head in the same trial. So I think we're still learning what are the pros and cons of these different approaches. However, I think the good news is that we know from a variety of studies that many of these different options, whether you're focusing on nutrients or focusing on a summary score, can be effective for changing consumer behavior. So policymakers have a number of options to choose from, and maybe we want to tinker around the edges to maximize the benefits of the policy, but any of these as a starting point would likely to be beneficial.
Great, that's a really good point and helpful. So related to another audience question from Dean Schillinger, which is a great one, and I'm going to ask maybe Gabby to start commenting on this, and then Sarah will get your thoughts. It's no secret that industry will often push hard against labeling systems, and we certainly saw that with calorie labeling. And so I'm just wondering, can you share a little bit about the experience in Latin America? What did that industry opposition look like? Somehow a lot of these policies passed. And so are there lessons to be learned? And then we'll kind of pivot to Sarah to think about industry in the US context.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that from the experience in different countries in the Latin American region, I would say that industry tactics are pretty much the same everywhere. So in several countries, for example, the industry will push for longer consultation periods. They will attack like very detailed elements from the regulation. They will push for more research and evidence, or say that there's no causal relationship between behaviors and these type of labels. They will claim that there is not enough evidence, or cast doubt of the evidence that is available. So that's those are some of the things that we could expect from the industry. So a recommendation along these lines is that we should avoid any loopholes in the regulation to try to be very specific, to not leave this these spaces for the industry to push back. Yeah.
Got it. And Sarah, can you talk about the US context and how you think that do you think this is likely to happen here?
Well, of course. So I think one key difference in the US is that we have the First Amendment looming large, and that the industry has really weaponized that since the 70s, when the Supreme Court extended that doctrine to cover companies to commercial speech. It's just kind of grown and grown. And we've seen most recently in tobacco warnings cases, just the difficulty and the challenge it is for the government to design an effective warning, given the different rules at play and the general conservative bent of our, increasingly conservative in the past few years, bent of our judicial system. And I'd say also that, depending on the warning, you kind of piss off different elements of the food industry. So in New York and Philly, where they were doing sodium warnings specific to sodium on restaurant menus, there was less of a pushback because restaurants aren't in the business of selling sodium, they sell food, right? So they have different options on their menus, and many of them didn't have the warning. And then there's no salt lobby. The Salt Institute dissolved. I love saying that. But there's no more salt lobby. And but if you're doing a more comprehensive system that includes added sugars, then you're talking about soda. Any kind of added sugars warning or information about added sugars that's clear and interpretive will encourage people to drink less soda. And the soda industry knows this, and so they're very litigious. They hired the best lawyers to fight some graphic warnings that the city of not graphic warnings, but some warnings on advertising that the city of San Francisco was attempting to require. And and what's so devastating about this is that if they do win, and it's based on the Constitution, it can have such sweeping effect even beyond the food label. They can change the state of the law for all public health warnings, and that's just very troubling and upsetting. So we have to tread carefully in this space.
Wow, great. That's an important insight. Thanks for sharing that. And Gabby, can you talk a little bit about maybe unintended consequences of these labels? We hope that they're going to promote healthy food choices, reduce health disparities, but there could be some problematic aspects. What are you seeing on the ground or in research?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in our research in Chile, we specifically looked at what happened with children's and adolescents' diets after implementation of Chile's regulation, using data from 2 cohort studies and looking at what the percentage of calories that children and adolescents ate at different locations, the percentage of calories from these nutrients of concern that were under the scope of the regulation: sugar, sodium, saturated fats. And we look at what they ate at school, at home, and at other locations, including restaurants and things that are not consumed at home and at school. And what we saw is that the percent of calories from these nutrients of concern significantly decreased at school. So children were, because those foods were not available anymore inside schools. But what we saw is that there was some sort of compensatory behavior at other locations. So probably these foods that were not under the scope of the regulation, like restaurant foods, etc. And because children and adolescents are growing over time, they are eating more of these foods. So there could be several reasons why we found this compensatory behavior, but the key message here is that it's important to highlight that front of pack labeling policies need to be complemented with other types of strategies in order to impact overall diet. So a reminder that it's not like a standalone policy, but should be complemented with other types of strategies.
Wow, so that's very interesting, and also a research implication of if you're studying these, trying to capture other eating occasions. Got it. So along those lines, Anna, can I ask you, and then we'll open it up to everyone to weigh in. There's a lot of researchers tuning in, interested in doing work in this area. What do you see as the key gaps? Like, what research questions should we be asking now?
That's a great question, Christina. I think there's 3 or 4 key gaps that are especially important for us to be thinking about. One research gap is that we're still learning about the longer term impacts of these policies on consumer behavior. So almost all experimental studies are pretty short term. A single exposure to warnings or other front of pack labels, for example. Our quasi experiments last a little bit longer. So there's data from Chile for up to 2 years after implementation. But after that point, we're still learning, do these effects persist? Do they get larger? Do they get smaller over time? And what policy supports might we want to put in place to make sure the effects are persistent? Another question to Gabby's prior comment is about how labeling policies might work synergistically with other policies like taxes, like marketing restrictions, like changes to the school food environment. So Chile implemented this suite of policies, and together they might have been more impactful than the sum of their parts, but research is still needed to untangle the independent and joint effects of the types of food policies we might implement in tandem with one another. The third thing I'll mention is that we're still learning how warnings affect different population groups. So how to design them to benefit health equity and what their impacts are once they're implemented across groups. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, we're still learning how to optimize the design of warnings. So again, the good news is that we have multiple promising options we think would be beneficial for public health, but still learning, what color should we use? What shape should we use? What system should we use to decide which products get which labels? We're still sort of tweaking the edges around those questions. So those are 4 research gaps I would be thinking about.
That's great. So let's stick with this theme of health equity that you raised, which is so important and, kind of always on a public health researcher's mind. I'm curious, and maybe looking at you, Sarah and Gabby, where you're doing more on the ground work or in a country that actually has a system. How can we, particularly maybe researchers, but advocacy groups, best engage communities that are affected by diet-related diseases in a disproportionate way, communities of color, in terms of getting input and thoughts about labeling, how we should do it, or being part of the advocacy process?
Yeah, I mean, I think CSPI recently became a grantor organization to work with states and localities on different policies, including these labeling policies. And it's really important to be able to do that outreach and center conversations with communities around, especially when you're developing a policy. So for example, in New York City, we're working with a group, Interfaith Public Health Network, that mobilizes faith communities around public health issues. And, in that city, initially the bill that got passed, it was very limited in scope. It only applied to sort of prepackaged sodas sold in restaurants. And the community was very clear that they wanted it to apply to fountain drinks and other, foods prepared on site. And so we've been working with them to really elevate that message and try to make sure that and really go back to the council and have them fix that bill. So that's been really important. We've also heard from folks around the sodium warnings that they only apply to the really, really high sodium meals. And that means that if you're going in and ordering off the dollar menu, that you may be building a high sodium meal off of little items, and the warning needs to apply more broadly across the menu because sodium is hiding out in other places. So, so those are really good pieces of input. But I think it's always challenging to try to kind of figure out how to incorporate what the community wants into a policy, and that's really where the crux of a lot of these conversations has to focus. And there's always more that we could do to open up the conversation.
Great. So just to build on that, one thing that a lot of us are thinking about in this space, and it looks like there's an audience question on it, is we came together excited about potential national front of package labeling, but there are obviously labeling initiatives at the local level. You'd mentioned the New York example. And so to what extent can you sort of talk about the trade-offs? How much should we be pursuing, more local and state policies versus national ones, and sort of which policies in which settings?
Yeah, so there's a very narrow space open for state and local policies, and it's around safety warnings. So that's how New York and Philly got their sodium warnings. So whatever you're thinking about doing, it can't sort of be just like a general, I think like a health score letter grade might veer more into the nutrition space, and something that's a stop sign warning might be more along the lines of a state and local, just as you think through the options. I'll say that in addition to the menu warnings, we hear a lot from community groups that they want something for bodegas, that they get a lot of their soda at corner stores and sort of limited service retailers. And there's not a lot of evidence around shelf tags or different options that could work in that environment that would be sort of not appearing on the food label itself, but something that's in the retail environment. So that might be one area to explore.
Got it. That's great. So another question related to the state of the research, and this will go to Gabby and Anna, and comes from the audience, is to talk a little bit more about reformulation. So Anna, you had mentioned we see this happening, but the question here is, are there particular categories that get reformulated and ones that are less likely? And can I also throw into this question concerns that some of that reformulation is happening with artificially sweeteners, and should we be worried about that? And Anna, maybe start with you, and then we'll go to Gabby.
Sure, and I'm glad Gabby's following me because I bet she knows even more about the Chile evaluations than I do. We are seeing that the movement in Chile is happening for products that are very close to the threshold. So the way the warnings work is that there's a threshold for, say, sugar per 100 grams of product. And if you're above that threshold, you have to do the warning. And if you're below, you don't. So you're seeing that products that are close are removing sugar so that they're below that threshold and don't have to apply the warning. Whereas really high sugar products are not reducing quite as much. So we're not seeing a shift of the curve. We're seeing things close to that threshold moving just below it. And we're seeing that for across the nutrients. So I think the food groups where there are more products near that threshold is also going to be where you see more of movement. So I guess breakfast cereals are one example where there's a lot of them that had sugar or calorie content right near those cutoffs. And so they reformulated quite a bit. The question about artificial sweeteners is interesting, and I'll be curious to hear what Gabby says. I think that's certainly a concern for added sugar warnings. For the other nutrients, there's not this artificial substitute we can put in. So when we remove saturated fat, there's not artificial saturated fat that can be put in. So I think that's the artificial ingredients is maybe less of a concern for the other nutrients besides sugar, but I do think it's an open question exactly how much artificial sweeteners or low calorie sweeteners are being added to compensate for the reduction in caloric sugars, and how would that impact public health? I think it will be sort of a balancing act of the costs and benefits of the policy on the way the reformulation takes place. But Gabby, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so regarding the food groups that are being reformulated most, of course, are drinks. So as Anna mentioned, so it's very easy to replace sugar with artificial sweeteners. So that is the food group that has been mostly reformulated. So foods in that group. And regarding the artificial sweeteners, we still don't know a lot of things. So what are the long-term effects of consuming this type of sweeteners, what happened with children and adolescents that are consuming those type of sweeteners in several reformulated drinks right now. So we don't know what will happen in terms of health, but it's very difficult to weigh in here because there's still a lot of research that is developing in this area, and as Anna also mentioned, it's very difficult to find a replacement for other nutrients. We have to see what happens in the next few years with the data that is ongoing. Yeah.
Got it. So let's talk a little bit about the healthy symbol. I'm curious what folks think. It seems obviously like a good idea to update the criteria that would underlie that. We want that to be aligned with dietary guidelines, et cetera. But, should we have a healthy symbol on processed foods, highly processed foods? And then related, and I know you've done some work here, the healthy symbol is sort of touting positive nutrients. And so what do we know about doing that versus kind of highlighting negative nutrients? Should we be doing both or neither? And maybe Anna, you could start us off.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. So to get everyone on the same page, the FDA has been conducting research into a potential healthy icon, as Sarah and others have mentioned, that companies could choose to display on foods that meet the FDA definition of healthy. So it'd be voluntary, and it would be meant to encourage purchases of healthy items, and there'd be no labels on less healthy foods that don't meet that definition. So the FDA is in the process of conducting literature reviews and experiments to finalize the design of this label. And while that work is ongoing, our team has done just one study on a label inspired by the FDA's label. So we tested a healthy label that was modeled after some of the mock designs that they have tested in focus groups. And our interest was in understanding, does this type of label encourage healthier purchases? Does it inform consumers? And how does it compare to the negative labels that countries like Chile have adopted that explicitly discourage unhealthy foods, as opposed to only encouraging healthy foods? And what we found, again, just in our one study, so lots more work to be done on this, is that the healthy label did encourage consumers to select healthier foods and drinks, but the unhealthy label performed even better. And the best outcomes were seen when we combined the two approaches. So when we had both healthy labels on healthier products and these negative unhealthy labels on less healthy products. So that suggests to us that it's possible that focusing only on the positive label for healthy foods might be a missed opportunity for maximizing the benefits of adopting a new front of package labeling system. Now, there's all sorts of political feasibility and legal constraints that might lead us a different direction. But I think the good news is that there's still time for the FDA to broaden its focus to develop a label that also would be displayed on unhealthy foods. And I think CSPI's petition to call for that sort of label is well timed, as the FDA is thinking more actively about new front of pack labeling systems.
Great. Sarah, do you have a view? What's your view on the healthy symbol?
I mean, we're supportive of FDA kind of tightening up the definitions, and in particular, added sugar wasn't part of its definition for healthy, so you could put healthy on high sugar cereals, which was ridiculous. But right now, about 15% of food labels qualify for healthy, and only 5% use healthy, and a lot of that is probably heart healthy, which is a special term that doesn't actually fall into any of this stuff. So it's really it's low utilization. And I don't know that putting an added sugar standard there and creating an icon is going to really boost participation. We've seen endorsement logos in other countries also tend to have really low uptake. And so the overall health impact of this is a little bit uncertain. And again, it doesn't tell you what to avoid. And a lot of our health problems that we have with nutrition in this country are around overconsumption of foods to avoid. So we really think it's critical to have a uniform system where you can compare between products, and the ones that are unhealthy are being flagged. And you just can't get that from a voluntary endorsement logo. I wanted to clarify, there was one comment in the chat about what FDA had proposed around this, because they've proposed the healthy icon, and then in the White House conference report this past few months, they've said that they're exploring front of package labeling. And someone asked, well, is that going to be just facts up front? And the answer is they haven't specified yet. And we know they're testing a couple of versions, just like they're testing the healthy icon, they're testing a few different front of package systems, but warnings are in there. So it's in the mix. And I think it's really important for the public health community to rally around the front of package system that's going to be most effective.
That's great. So I've tried to integrate audience questions along the way, but we still have many more to go through. And I actually think Marissa Hall is going to come online she's been tracking them to ask a few more.
Thanks, Christina. And thanks I think you've done a great job of handling audience questions throughout. I think just picking up on what Sarah just said, I would love to ask a question that's actually not specifically in the audience Q&A, but hear your thoughts on, at this moment, given what we're seeing around the momentum with the White House strategy, what do you think we specifically should be doing in the public health research community to help kind of communicate our scientific findings to people who can use them right now?
Well, I'll say our petition has an open docket. So FDA posts petitions on regulations.gov. And I don't know if we can circulate the link to participants after the meeting, but you're welcome to submit written comments and that window won't close. So you can submit comments at any time, just summarizing if you have relevant research to summarize for the agency. And in particular, they're going to be looking for, does it serve a government interest? So does it correct misinformation? Does it inform consumers? Does it positively impact behavior to benefit public health? And so that type of evidence is going to be really helpful for the agency. And then if you have a preferred front of package system to highlight that and make recommendations.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We'll make sure to get that link out to folks. Coming back a little bit to the healthy icon before we move kind of away from that, to bring in a question from the chat. If anyone knows about if we know anything from the example from Israel, which has this kind of positive endorsement logo coupled with nutrient warnings, and any thoughts on what we might know about Israel, about how the warning labels have worked along with the positive label. And if you don't know it, that's okay too. I don't know the answer to that. It's a great question. Okay, I'm going to take that silence as a question to hold our next webinar. We're hoping we'll actually focus on a deeper dive into multiple international labeling policies. And so we'll bring that one back. I will bring a question about online nutrition front of package labeling, which I know is something that we've been thinking about in both research settings and policy settings. So how do we kind of translate? Well, I guess one question is, in the potential policies that are out there or proposed, how are those really focused on brick and mortar only? Is there any room for moving some of these labeling systems into online retail settings, especially as we see increases in online grocery shopping throughout the pandemic, as well as any research kind of needs related to that?
So right now, there's no requirement for the online retail space for what kind of label information should be posted. If you're selling a restaurant menu, then you're supposed to have the calories visible, although third-party apps often don't, and we're working on that. But for like grocery stores, there's no rules. And so one of the challenges is that the retailer often isn't the manufacturer. So you couldn't feasibly ask them to post any info that's not printed on the package already, but we do think that there'd be strong support for a federal law that said that when you're selling foods online, you have to have all the information that consumers can access when they're looking at the food in the store. And so that's something that we do hope to shoot for. Now, there's this question about like, how should it be formatted, right? Because there's so much, a website is different or an app is different than the food label. And so I think that there's some good opportunities for research there and in sort of how you can present this information to consumers to make sure that they're receiving the right message, getting the info they need.
Thank you. And then I'd love to hear from Anna and then Gabby on any thoughts from a research setting, from a research standpoint, what are some unanswered questions with online supermarkets and food labeling?
Yeah, I guess that I can comment from the experience with Chile. So in Chile, if you go online into a grocery store, you will see the label. So each each picture of each product that is offered online has the label if it complies with the thresholds. So I think that it shouldn't be very difficult, I think, from the point of view of implementation, but probably, yeah, you will have to deal with some legal issues and other things. But from the experience in Chile, it's feasible. So yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Gabby. Anna, anything to add?
That's great to hear that it's being implemented in Chile already. And as usual, Latin America leading the way on these policies. I would be interested to, as a research question, how the labels interact with the marketing practices that are used online that are maybe harder to use in the supermarket, like tailoring what is suggested to you as you're checking out, or tailoring ads in a way that can't be done in the brick and mortar environment. So you might imagine labels having a different effect in the online space than they have in brick and mortar stores. And I think that's at least an unanswered question from my point of view, though perhaps others can speak to it.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, so going back to Gabby, I would love to hear if you have any thoughts based on this question in the Q&A. So Chile passed a SSB tax in 2014 and then labeling in around 2016, 2017. So, you know, there's a lot going on there. Do you have any sense on whether there's time series data to allow examination of additive effects of these policies or anything, you know, on that front? And if not, I would love to just broadly hear any folks' thoughts on kind of research needs to help understand the interaction of policies like labeling with taxes, for example.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that it's important to note that in Chile, the package of regulations was implemented nationally. So it's very difficult when you are evaluating a time series to really disentangle these independent effects of, for example, what was the effect of the marketing regulation? What was the effect of the front of pack labeling? What was the effect of the school regulation? So it's when we see this from the researcher point of view, it's very difficult to disentangle. But because most regulations not only in Chile, but in other countries were implemented at the national level. And I think that that's different from the US, where taxes, for example, on sugary beverages were implemented at the state level. And it's easier to compare or to do some impact evaluations and see what happened. So that's something, it's like a limitation of several of the Chile's evaluations, but yeah, to consider. Yeah.
And I think it's speaks to, I think, the importance of different kinds of study designs that I think help us answer different kinds of questions in this space. And so I think we can complement some of the quasi-experimental work with maybe randomized trials that could test some of these interactions as well. So we're excited to see how that progresses. I'm going to throw out a question that I've been wondering about, specifically directed at Sarah, and just as some context for folks on the webinar, there was if you haven't been following, there's the district court, I might get the language wrong, but a district court in Texas last week ruled against the graphic cigarette pack warning labels. And there were a couple issues brought up, including how whether we can know if people are accurately interpreting imagery, as well as some concerns about how burdensome or not this policy is. And so I would love any thoughts, if you have looked through the court ruling, to think, is there anything we should be thinking about for nutrition labeling in the US based on that recent case?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much new comes out of this case. We knew that burden is an issue. So the size of the warning, how difficult it is to fit it on the label is always going to be an issue. We knew already that graphics are the third rail for the First Amendment, and that the First Amendment test requires that the warning be factual and uncontroversial. And graphic information is just so much richer than text. It's, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then the courts are going to find at least a few of those words to be misleading and or controversial. And that's sort of what's happening here, is that it's just very hard to kind of stick to the facts when you have a picture. And as much as we might disagree with that, and as horrible it is from a public health perspective, that's the landscape we're living in. Now, that doesn't mean we can't do all warnings. We can have pictorial information that might be less rich, that's more like an icon. We can still have textual warnings. And in fact, we petitioned with the knowledge of these cases, believing that it is possible to have a factual and uncontroversial statement about that tells consumers what's in the food and how to interpret that. And so, there's still a path forward here, but it is, it's difficult, and it's, important to be aware of this legal landscape as we make policy.
Thanks, Sarah. And building off of that, to address one more audience question, we see from international examples as well as in the US that we can expect industry fight about nutrient style warnings. Is there any kind of middle ground that we might be able to agree on in terms of, would a Nutri-Score kind of evaluative approach be potentially less challenged by industry or fare better in the courts, or any kind of thoughts on like the legal feasibility? And related, if there's any final thoughts on kind of whether the local and state momentum may be sort of ground softening for more sweeping federal food labeling policy. There's a lot in there. I'm going to start, maybe we can start with Sarah and then see if Gabby and Anna have thoughts.
Yeah, no, so I said at the beginning that our petition was for nutrient specific warnings. And part of that is that FDA has a statute. They have to sort of, they're humble servants to Congress. They have to do what Congress says. And Congress said, talk about nutrients with the nutrition facts panel. And, FDA decided to create nutrition facts, but they can do other things. They can put it on the front, they can talk about it in different ways, but it's all sort of around these nutrients and helping people understand in the context of the diet. So that's why we lean towards systems that focus on nutrients. So the South American warnings, maybe a stoplight system, but really nutrients focused. And I think when you get into systems like Nutri-Score, not only are you kind of veering away from the FDA authority and talking about maybe Congress could pass a new law, but FDA, it's harder for them to do that. But also, the level of controversy potentially increases because you have multiple elements that you're trying to balance against each other. And you're trying to say like this food is healthier than that food. And so it does become a little more complicated and potentially more controversial. So the more simple the system, the less controversy.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We got through most of the questions. There are a couple I've flagged, including this nutrient profile issue, when we come back to do a deeper dive on the international policies. So with that, I want to turn things back to Christina to just quickly send us off and wrap up, and want to thank all the panelists and attendees for being here as well.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and wonderful audience engagement and questions, and always giving us ideas for future webinars that we hope you'll tune into. But thank you so much to the panelists. So many interesting, important perspectives: legal, advocacy, international, deep dive into research, and thanks to Marissa and again to Healthy Eating Research. And yeah, great, lots to think about. So hope everyone enjoys the rest of the day. Bye.